Kevin, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be back with you now for, believe it or not, the third year of this conference of Constellation by Northwell Health. I am broadcasting today from a secure and undisclosed location in a tree-strewn suburb of New Jersey where the storms blew through the other day. I'm looking forward to a 20-minute conversation with two terrific participants today. First is Joaquin Duato. He is vice chair of the executive committee at Johnson & Johnson, the world's probably premier pharmaceutical company. He oversees, has responsibility for the company's consumer businesses, its pharmaceutical business, its supply chain, and its technology, which begs the question, what the heck else is there at Johnson & Johnson? But I suppose it's a big company, and there's plenty of other at J&J. In as much as he is responsible for technology, if anything goes wrong with our technology, Joaquin, we're coming to you to fix it. Cori Bargmann is the head of science at the Zuckerberg Institute. She joins us today from New York City. She is also a professor at Rockefeller University. Her specialties are neuroscience, neurobiology, and genetics, where, among other things, earlier in her career, she learned everything there was to learn about the brains and wiring, I'm told, of worms. That would be a very interesting conversation in and of itself. We'll save that for another time. Welcome, participants. We're glad you could join us today. And we'll move through various topics today, largely on COVID, but not necessarily all there. But let me begin there because that is top of mind and top of agenda. And ask each of you how life for you professionally has changed. Not how you do your jobs. We all know that we're doing them remotely by and large, but what you are concentrating on today that maybe you weren't concentrating on a year ago. Not how you work, but what your priorities, what your organization's priorities are today that are different from where they were a year ago. Cori, why don't I begin with you?
Sure. I am leading a philanthropy founded by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan. And our original charge was to think in the very long term about what new technologies and science were going to be needed to ultimately solve all diseases by the end of the century. So we had this long-term view of what we were trying to do. We wanted to think in decades. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves in a situation where we really need to be thinking in days and weeks and months. And so that was a big change for us. And I'll just give one example of how that reoriented our work. We have an amazing project with a collaborative research site called the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub in San Francisco that has created space-age tools that enable you to use DNA sequencing to identify any virus, any bacterium, any pathogen in any sick person, even if it's never been seen before. And we were starting to set that up in places like Bangladesh and Cambodia and Malawi to do monitoring of diseases around the world. And all of a sudden, we realized that we had diseases right here at home that we needed to think about, and we knew exactly what they were. And that whole team pivoted to their collaborators in the San Francisco Bay Area and said, what can we do? We want to be humble. We want to collaborate. We want to help out the state and the city. So these sort of space-age technologists set up testing in San Francisco, helped UCSF Hospital go within the course of 10 days from being able to test 16 people a day for COVID-19 to 2,000 people a day. And then after working with UCSF for a little while in that testing facility, and UCSF got their own wheels back on, the state came to us and said, we're desperate for testing. And so we've been working with the departments of public health. And we're doing something like, I think, 50,000 tests so far for the departments of public health to understand how the virus is spreading through communities in California. And it uses some of the very high-tech informatics and molecular biology that this group knows how to do, but it's solving very immediate problems, like helping us to understand that part-time healthcare workers who move between different facilities were serving as a site of spread of the virus between different communities and helping us focus on them to make California safer.
I hear you say, Cori, basically that one of the things that have changed, or three of the things that have changed, are having to pivot from the very long-term focus that the initiative began with to something that was very immediate. Number two would be marshaling resources and pivoting the organization to focus on a very specific problem. and to do it at speed, right?
Yes. And this has really been a surprise for me, maybe, that here we were thinking we were a philanthropy and we were long-term. And one of the things that everyone has seen in this spring is how hard it is to be fast and flexible, how hard it is for our existing systems, medical systems, public health systems, supply chain to really work fast. And somewhat to our surprise, we ended up being in a good position to do that. And we're just happy to throw our support behind the people who are in the trenches.
Joaquin, I would assume that some of the things Cori just mentioned have been really a part of your pivot in your job from a year or so ago. But how is what you're doing and what you are prioritizing today at J&J different from what you might have been doing a year ago? Obviously, J&J is among the many companies that are involved in trying to find a vaccine for this, and that's got to be part of it. But what's different today in what you're doing at work?
Thank you, Tyler. So first and foremost, COVID-19 is a humanitarian crisis which has affected millions of people. And for a healthcare company like Johnson & Johnson, our priority was to focus all our efforts, resources, science, and people in trying to address COVID-19. In a way, we had an opportunity to step up. We have the right global reach, the right investments and depth of science in the company. And it was an opportunity for us to show the value of the life science companies and in particular of Johnson & Johnson. So from the beginning, my job has been focused in responding to COVID-19. And in our case, to set the priorities, we have a very clear blueprint. Many of the people in the audience know that at Johnson & Johnson, we have our credo that establishes a hierarchy of stakeholders, starting with the patients, the employees, the communities, and the shareholders, that we have had as a blueprint for decision-making during 75 years. And that blueprint is that we use what we use in order to address COVID-19. So 4 things there. The first one, we wanted to make sure that we were ensuring the supply of our life-saving medicines, medical devices, and consumer products across the world. So that was important for us. And as people in healthcare went to work to the hospitals, our 50,000 employees working in the manufacturing plants globally want to work every day during the lockdowns, during this crisis, in order to be able to supply the medicines, medical devices that consumers and patients rely on. So that was our first responsibility. The second one, we wanted to make sure that our employees were safe. So we needed to establish the protocols that were going to enable that business continuity, but having our employees safe. And anecdotally, I'll tell you that we have many employees that are healthcare professionals at Johnson & Johnson, and we offer our employees that were healthcare professionals a leave policy for them to be able to volunteer for COVID. And we have hundreds of employees across the world that have been on the front lines of working as physicians, nurses, pharmacists, addressing COVID-19. Then the third one was to support frontline healthcare workers in our communities. And we have made a special effort and significant donations in order to be able to support frontline healthcare workers. And finally, perhaps the one that has received more attention that I'm sure you want to discuss more later, we embarked since January this year, when we got to know the genetic sequence of the virus, in the development of a vaccine. So I am sure we'll talk more about the development of a vaccine, but now we know we're going to be living with COVID-19 until we have a vaccine. So for us, it was very important to move on, develop a vaccine, and at the same time reflecting our values in this exceptional situation. We also have announced that we are going to be developing the vaccine at a non-for-profit price during the pandemic situation. So in a way, only a company like Johnson & Johnson can have the scope that I'm telling you. And I do think that this is the type of situation where companies as solid as Johnson & Johnson can step up and can shine.
Since you raised it, why don't we linger there for just a minute, and I'll ask you the question, and then Cori the same question. How confident are you that medical science will be able to find an effective vaccine that is safe and reliable and potentially lasting, And how soon do you expect that to happen if you do? Because there are diseases that have defied vaccines.
Yeah. So I would say this is a moment of exceptional collaboration in the industry, in the life science industry, to develop a vaccine. Exceptional collaboration between governments, regulatory agencies, academic institutions, companies, and hence you see the numbers of vaccines that are in development. So there's a concept that I would like to stress from the beginning, Tyler. This is not a situation where companies are competing with each other, although it may be depicted like that in the media. There's a situation where companies are collaborating and our competitor is the virus. So this collaboration has been exceptional, and that's one of the reasons you see so many projects and such a speed in the development side. So look, in our area, I'm sure Cori will tell you, we are as confident as the data tell us. So the data is what is going to drive any type of confidence here. What we see is that different companies, including us, have produced data both in animal models and in patients that show good immune response of different vaccines, and at the same time also good safety. We just published ourselves last week our studies in animal models in Nature showing a good response both from an immunological perspective and also good safety. And we are starting now our phase 1, phase 2A clinical trials. So we'll see. The data will tell us how good it is. I can tell you that this is unprecedented in how many companies and the type of investments it's been made, not only to develop the vaccine, which is important, but also to be able to manufacture the vaccine in sufficient quantities so we can vaccinate billions of people.
So your confidence, I'm inferring, is quite high. Give me a quick sense before I turn to Cori about timeline.
Our timeline, it depends on the data, as I said, and it depends on the regulatory authorities, how they evaluate the data. Mm-hmm. But in general, what you can read is that there's some vaccines, not ours, that may have data to be presented to the regulatory authorities by the end of this year. And then our vaccine, if everything goes well, will be able to be presented to the regulatory authorities beginning very early in 2021. So that's the time frame you're going to see. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, in parallel, we are building a supply chain that is going to be able to manufacture billions of vaccines in order to address the demand that is going to exist.
So let me turn to you, Cori, and you're free to pick up and take the question any way you want to, but let me turn it just a little bit to a researcher's point of view. What are the kinds of things that we know today about biology and gene sequencing and so forth of viruses that we might not have known years ago that are happening in labs like the ones you supervise that will make a virus like this subject to a vaccine sooner rather than later? In other words, what do we know today that gives us the ability potentially to bring out a vaccine in a year's time as opposed to 4 years' time, which is much more common for vaccines? And what do you know as a researcher that might give you confidence that we can do that?
So I will say, first of all, that this has, in fact, been an amazing time of collaboration between the companies and the governments to make this happen. There's been a commitment to making these things available, not just to the rich countries, but to the low and middle income countries, that I think is very important and significant for a worldwide pandemic. And then I think, what we have seen is an incredible flourishing of creative approaches, some of the traditional vaccine approaches, but some completely new things that have never been tried before. I believe very strongly that one of these will create a vaccine that is safe and effective. I also believe that we will have a vaccine pretty soon, and I don't believe that those two things are necessarily the same thing. So as a scientist, I would say we have learned a lot about not just viruses, but about the immune system over the past years. We're looking at those things together as scientists, and it's incredibly important that as these vaccines are developed, they are looked at not just from the perspective of getting past the regulatory authorities, but also learning as much as we can about the science at the same time. is monitoring the patients, monitoring the people that they're tried in, figuring out which are most effective, figuring out which are most effective in what people. Are different vaccines better for children and for older people? Are different approaches helping us to solve one part of the problem versus another part? And so I think we will need to continue this policy of broad sharing of information, of gathering a lot of scientific information about the first people who will get the vaccines, who will, to some extent, really be research participants that we have to think of as equal participants in this process, and to recognize their sacrifice by their risk-taking, by saying we will learn everything we can, and that will go into the common development of better vaccines in the future.
The time is, go ahead, I'm sorry, I thought you were finished.
Yeah.
Go finish your thought.
The path to a fast vaccine is through science and through collaboration.
Before time is flying by here, and before we get to our final question or two, let me stay with you, Cori, if I might, because one of the things it vectors a little bit away from COVID, but obviously it bears upon it. And the question is, how is technology and computing power and the advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all the things we hear about going to change what you are able to do, what medical science is able to do, what is possible now or on the horizon now that would not have been possible but for these advances in technology of the sort that Joaquin supervises at J&J? How is computing power going to change the possibilities and potentials of medical science?
I spend a lot of time in the technology sector now, and I would just like to say that the thing that computers really have over people is boredom tolerance. They are able to analyze millions and billions of data points in ways that no human can, and that's what we can use them for. And they will have a transformative effect on medicine when we are able to provide for them the high quality data that allow them to make these discoveries. The computers don't really help you with 100 patients. For that, you can have a single doctor. They don't even really help you that much with 1,000 patients, because that you can do in spreadsheets. But when we can combine our knowledge about different kinds of patients, different environments, different data sets, that's when computing power really makes things powerful. So one of the things we work on really hard at the Philanthropy is helping people to build tools to share information much more quickly in safe and secure fashions, never sharing patient data, but really just making it possible to combine those data to allow the computers to work their magic.
Let's go to a couple of concluding questions. And Joaquin, I'll start with you. And it's a broad one and a basic one. As you look back over the past year, what have you learned? And what do you think the lasting changes of the COVID experience will be for medical science, for healthcare delivery, for research, for funding, and the diseases that we concentrate on? What have you learned, and what will the lasting changes be as you look out over the broad field of medicine and healthcare?
What I have learned is that how long collaboration and having clear priorities can take us. I mean, what this has created, Tyler, is a very clear sense of what was the priority. The priority was to defeat the virus, and when the priorities are clear, then everything else, all the puzzle comes together, and then we can have this tremendous impact, as I hope we're going to be having with the vaccines and the treatments. So having a clear priority and collaboration to achieve that, I think it's a great lesson of this pandemic. Now, what are going to be the lasting changes of this pandemic, other than this sense of collaboration that I hope we keep in place in order to prepare for future pandemics? Clearly, there's going to be an acceleration of the incorporation of technology and digitization at all levels, not only in science, but also in every aspect of the operations of the company. So that's been tremendously accelerated at all levels of the company. For example, during this pandemic at supply chain, when we were trying to plan for our manufacturing, we use very sophisticated data analytics techniques and data science in order to be able to sense the changes in the demand so we can supply our products everywhere in the world. For example, imagine, Tyler, this is Johnson & Johnson is a very large company. We have done a virtual book closure every trimester now, which needed certain automation of certain tasks, but certainly improve all our digital process so we can do a virtual book closure. And I think it's clearly helping, for example, in enabling us to conduct our clinical trials more efficiently by using data science to identify in what areas we're going to conduct the clinical trials in order to maximize and optimize recruitment. So certainly technology, it's going to be accelerating. I do believe that technology is one of the most important game changers in our generation. I do think that the integration of biology and genetics with technology could be the one thing that could be the game changer for this century. It could help us advance in the medical field more than we have advanced in the past. So I think that this is going to be a long-lasting change. There's going to be other areas which are going to be important for, particularly for a company like us, that we're going to have to take as lessons is how important is to have the right global supply chain footprint in order to be able to be resilient in situations like this where you have lockdowns, places which are stopped, and how we're going to be able to navigate having a resilient supply chain, particularly when you are dealing with essential medicines.
I see. Go ahead, finish your thought, please, Joaquin.
Yeah, those three things would be the most important ones. Collaboration for future pandemics, and digitization and progress in technology, and revisiting how we manufacture and how we produce so we have a strong supply chain which is resilient under shocks.
I saw Cori nodding really throughout your answer there, Joaquin, and so I'm going to let her close it off with her perspectives there, but we didn't really get to the question of supply chain. It was one of the topics that we'll have to cover another time because I think it's a fascinating one in light of sensitivities about where drugs and drug constituents are manufactured, how we get them, who gets them first, who gets them in what, and whether the manufacturing ability is there to produce at scale, at the scales we're going to need. But Cori, let me let you conclude and pick up either on what Joaquin said or amplify how is what we're going to do? What are the lasting changes that you think are going to come out of this experience?
The lasting changes that I hope very much will come out of this experience are, in fact, a culture of collaboration, a recognition that we have common enemies. The virus is a common enemy. Cancer is a common enemy. And that only by working together and by sharing information are we going to make the progress we want to make, not by keeping it locked up in individual institutions. And then the second thing is communication. I think we've really seen, I hope very much that we recognize how important our public health system is. It's been sort of neglected and underfunded compared to other parts of our medical community in the US. It's not as sophisticated technologically as the pharmaceutical industry or biomedical science for that matter. These people are still using fax machines. And so we really need to be building up what we've learned in some of these other sectors into the public health sector to make them be able to do their best work too, because we see how important they are right now.
Cori Bargmann, Joaquin Duato, thank you so much for your spending some time today. I think we illuminated several areas there that are important and of lasting significance. Thank you very, very much for your participation today. And I think I'm supposed to toss it back to Kevin. Thank you.